Oh God, they burned my flag right on my front porch and laughed at an old veteran. It wasn't a decorative scrap of cloth. It was the flag that once flew over the battlefield in Iraq, the flag that draped my comrade's coffin. That morning, coffee cup in hand, I saw smoke rising from the trash pit, the reek of scorched fabric blending with memories of blood and gun smoke. People said I was too emotional. The Homeowners Association called it emotionally divisive. But when the HOA Karen dared to set fire to a sacred symbol that was a declaration of war, and I have to tell the whole truth, this isn't just a story about a flag. This is a battle in the middle of an ordinary American neighborhood. The first thing he smelled was smoke. The second was memory. It pierced his chest like a thin, sharp blade. Bitter, no different from the stench of burning paint mixed with regret. It wasn't the smell of a campfire, nor the smoke of barbecued meat. It was the heavy reek of burning fabric, the kind of smoke that should never exist in a quiet neighborhood. And for a man who had spent his life amid explosions, he knew instantly. Someone had crossed the line. San Antonio, Texas. A sweltering July morning. John Mercer, Navy SEAL veteran, 62, had just poured himself a cup of black coffee. He meant to sit down on the old wooden chair on the porch, the one he had built with his own hands after leaving the service, where he would quietly watch his neighbors come and go each morning. But before he could take the first sip, the smoke found him, curling around like a warning no one ever wants to hear. He followed the current of wind, his eyes narrowing. Behind the HOA office, thick smoke coiled upward, black, heavy, furious, as if trying to hide itself. Then something tumbled down a trembling triangle, edges charred, its red, white, and blue marred into streaks of black. It hit the ground, shivered once, and lay still on the asphalt. John knew that shape instantly. He knew it down to his bones. The coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the concrete. His feet moved before his mind could command them. He walked straight to the dumpster, where the smoke still rose. Shattered glass, charred wood, twisted metal fused into a heap of wreckage. But in the midst of it all, one form remained intact, folded, pressed down, as if daring the flames to consume it. The flag. His American flag. The flag that had once flown atop a warship as John and his brothers sailed across the Persian Gulf in 1991. The flag that had been folded and placed upon the coffin of a fallen brother in Fallujah. The flag that, since retiring, he had hung on his porch every Memorial Day, not to boast, but as a silent vow that he had never forgotten. And now, here it was, burned, thrown into the trash like waste, like a memory stripped of worth. John said nothing. He simply stood there, quietly lifting the charred fabric, feeling the acrid smoke cling to his fingers. His heart weighed heavy as stone, but his eyes burned bright, the eyes of a man too familiar with loss, now bearing witness to another, crueler one. John had been out of the service for over 20 years. He lived with his wife, Mary Ann, in a newly built subdivision outside San Antonio. Day after day, he quietly tended to his porch, replacing wooden planks, tightening the bolts on the flagpole. But in the eyes of the neighbors, John was no hero. He was just the odd old man, too quiet, his gaze too sharp for anyone to hold long. A man who still flinched at the roar of an engine. The children whispered among themselves, "He killed people in the Middle East." And in every HOA meeting, one name rang out like a warning bell. Karen Whitmore. A powerful woman, her blonde hair neatly curled, living in a beige-painted house as pristine as a showroom. To Karen, everything had to match, had to be harmonious. From the color of the doors, to the potted plants on porches, to John's American flag, everything had to fit within the rules. To her, that flag wasn't a symbol of sacrifice. It was decor that caused emotional division. In Karen's eyes, it was no different than a plastic lawn bear placed out of order. In John's eyes, it was a vow of life and death. He had once risked his life in Iraq, in Afghanistan, burying himself in sand and smoke to make sure that flag never fell into enemy hands. Yet now, in the peaceful heart of America, it was his own neighbors who had struck it down, coldly labeling it a violation of aesthetic code. John stood there, staring at the blackened fabric, and he knew this was not just about a piece of cloth. It was a reminder that his war had never truly ended. And if this battle was not in Fallujah or Basra, but right here in San Antonio, was he ready to step into it? All right, my dear audience, before we move into the heart of the story, take a moment to hit that subscribe button or drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story compelling and want to discover what comes next. John stood for a long time over the charred piece of flag, smoke still clinging to his fingers. The sight dragged him back to the place he always tried to bury, the deserts of Iraq, the sound of roadside bombs, the Humvee thrown into the air like a cheap toy. He remembered clearly Ramos, the young soldier seated beside him, his chest torn open, blood pouring out uncontrollably. In that moment, John had pulled the flag from the vehicle and pressed it against Ramos's chest, not to stop the bleeding, but so Ramos could depart, carrying the symbol of home. Ramos looked at him, smiled faintly, and closed his eyes. A smile John had carried with him for 20 years. Since returning, he had never told anyone about this, not even Marianne, his wife, the only one patient enough to sit beside him whenever the nightmares came back. To the neighbors, that flag was just an old decoration. But to John, it was a living grave, where he remembered Ramos and all those who never made it home. And now the Homeowners Association called it divisive decoration. A $500 fine appeared in his mailbox. Violation of aesthetic regulations. John crushed the paper into a ball and tossed it in the trash. The next day, another letter arrived, this time $1,000. Then $2,000. Along with it, a line of threat, smooth and cold. If you do not remove it, we will take enforcement action. In HOA meetings, Karen Whitmore, the woman with a smile that seemed rehearsed in front of a mirror, always stressed the harmony of the community. To her, a door painted a shade off color was enough to ruin the aesthetic standard, let alone an old flag darkened by smoke and fire. Karen recited the HOA regulations as fluently as scripture, clutching her binder so tightly that people half believed it contained the U.S. Constitution itself. And John just sat in the back of the room, silent. He knew if he spoke, his voice would crack, and his eyes, the eyes of a man who had once watched his brothers die in his hands, would make others uncomfortable. People did not like that kind of heavy silence. They wanted smiles, small talk about flower beds, or Sunday barbecue recipes. They didn't want to remember that some men had once gone far away so they could live in this peace. One afternoon, John found a small notice pinned to the community bulletin board, right below the poster for the summer BBQ. All porch items of political or divisive nature will be subject to removal. He gave a dry, bitter laugh. To them, the American flag, the same flag draped over the coffins of thousands of soldiers, was now lumped together with campaign signs for a mayoral candidate. Marianne looked at him and smiled, but it was a smile tinged with bitterness. At least they let us keep the cactus. John glanced at the tiny pot sitting on the porch, thought for a moment, and replied, "Yeah, probably because it knows how to stay quiet." Sometimes, gentle sarcasm was the only way they kept from breaking down in front of each other. But deep inside, he knew he was being pushed to the edge, not just by the fines, not just by the soulless paperwork, but by a familiar feeling, the sense of being treated as a burden, an outsider in the very community he had once sworn to protect. On evenings, John sat on the porch, staring at the empty flagpole. He remembered every moment on the battlefield, when men raised that flag over rubble and everyone saluted in silence. To him it was pride, it was pain, it was everything that remained. To the HOA it was merely an aesthetic violation, an excuse to write another fine. He quietly watched the numbers climb in the envelopes they sent. $500, $1,000, $2,000. They stacked up as though they wanted to turn sacrifice into a financial debt. John knew this war was unlike any he had ever fought. Here, the enemy did not fire bullets, did not plant mines. They used fines, signatures, and something called aesthetic harmony. Yet that coldness cut deeper into his pride than any shrapnel ever had. And one question began to take shape in his mind. If they dared to burn the flag, would they stop there? John did not respond with shouting or a furious punch. He simply bent down, picked up the charred remnant of the flag, and held it in his trembling hands. His face was silent as stone, but inside, the fire raged hotter than the smoke swirling around him. It was the kind of fire only those who had watched their brothers fall could understand. Quiet, deep, but impossible to extinguish. Neighbors passed by, casting cautious glances his way. To them, John was nothing more than the eccentric old man whose eyes seemed to pierce through people. But then Mike Sanders appeared, the loud neighbor, 35 years old, a former Marine. He shuffled along in worn-out slippers, carrying a steaming box of donuts, looking nothing like a warrior. Yet when his eyes fell on the flag in John's hands, he muttered only one line. "Sir, burning a flag to us, that's a declaration of war." A simple sentence, but it made John nod slightly. At least here he wasn't completely alone. From that day forward, Mary Ann, Mike, and John quietly began gathering clues. They dug through every fine notice, every newly issued regulation, every HOA statement. What they found was not just a list of aesthetic violations. It was an entire hidden plan, labeling houses with flags or military memorabilia as divisive, forcing residents to leave, then reselling the properties to a real estate company whose director's seat was occupied by none other than Karen Whitmore's husband. John held the printed stack of documents, pages dense with text, and he knew this was no longer about a flag. This was a new battle not fought with rifles, but with schemes. A war fought in suits. Still, John remained a man of discipline. He did not storm into the HOA office to slam the table and shout. Instead, he chose to observe in silence. He still repaired the flagpole with his own hands, still drank his coffee each morning, but in his eyes now gleamed the vigilance of a soldier awaiting deployment. Sometimes Mike dropped by, carrying a box of powdered donuts. He'd munch while grumbling. "This HOA's no different from commanders barking orders at midnight." Mary Ann chuckled softly. "Different. At least your commanders saluted the flag." Her words were light as air, but they made John tighten his grip on the charred remnant. He knew Mary Ann understood everything, understood that the flag was not mere decoration, but the tether that bound him to the brothers buried in far-off deserts. At night, when the neighborhood sank into silence, John dreamed of Ramos's face. That faint smile would surface in the dust and smoke, then dissolve, leaving behind the echoing wail of molten steel. He'd jolt awake, his shirt soaked with sweat. Mary Ann never asked, only quietly brought him a towel, resting her hand on his shoulder. That touch spoke more than any words. "I know. I'm here." Inside John, past and present collided. On one side, the battlefield, where sacrifice was honored by the flag draped over coffins. On the other, a small neighborhood, where that same flag was called an aesthetic violation. The irony made him want to laugh and cry all at once. One day, Mike coaxed John into walking the neighborhood. As they passed the HOA office, Mike jerked his head toward the roof and whispered, "See that tile? I swear it's off by 3 inches from regulation." Both men let out low chuckles, bitter but enough to keep them from choking on the suffocating air. But behind the laughter lay a harsh truth. The HOA wasn't only targeting the flag. They were targeting men like John, aging veterans, quiet but carrying in their hearts something Karen and her allies would never understand: honor. John realized he was being tested once again, not by mines or bullets, but by soulless fine slips, fake smiles, and the cold recitation of bylaws. And it was in that very quietness that his true character began to reveal itself, not through an explosive act, but through patience, through the way he still stood tall, unbowed. He knew that flag had once survived bombs and bullets, and this time he would not let it fall to the stroke of a pen. The only question left was, how would he stand up when the enemy carried no gun but carried the law? So, what do you think will happen next? Before we dive into the crucial part, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It brings me joy to know I'm walking this journey with friends from all around the world. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in Maplewood was as tense as a drawn bowstring. The community hall, usually used for morning yoga classes, was now packed, chairs filled to capacity, with many left standing against the walls. Harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the cold tile floor, turning the space into a temporary courtroom. At the center sat Karen Whitmore, her back straight, a bright yellow blazer wrapped around her as though to mask her unease. Her hands clutched a thick file, binder clips snapping like weapons ready to be aimed at anyone. The familiar smile was still there, cold, stiff, but it couldn't conceal the nervous flickers in her eyes. This time, John Mercer didn't walk in alone. Mike strode right beside him, his face calm but his shoulders taut like a drawn bow. 3 other local veterans were present as well, their old uniforms faded, but their eyes blazing. Marianne followed quietly behind, clutching a thick folder of documents like a silent witness to the truth. And in John's hands, a glass case, holding the burned remains of the flag. The room fell into silence as he placed it on the board's table. The sound of glass striking wood cracked through the space, carrying farther than any words. No speeches were needed. John let the flag speak for itself. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. Karen raised an eyebrow, her voice dripping with honey yet laced with mockery. She called the flag a divisive object, a comment that might have seemed harmless, but in a room full of families who had lost loved ones for this country, it landed like a stone cast into still water. Mike couldn't hold back. His voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the air. The true division was the HOA burning away the memory and sacrifice of soldiers. A ripple of murmurs surged through the crowd. Then Marianne switched on the projector. A white light swept across the wall, revealing page after page of documents. Lists of homes marked for strategic conversion. A leaked recording from a private meeting, Karen's voice ringing clear, referring to the veterans in the neighborhood as a bunch of useless PTSD cases. Whispers turned into shouts. A widow could no longer contain herself. She stood, shoulders trembling, recounting through sobs how they had once forced her to remove her late husband's medals from her porch, calling them non-compliant. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but her voice rang out like a bell. Then an elderly man rose, Mr. Lee, a frail Vietnam veteran. His trembling hand lifted as he choked out the story of how they had painted over the flag mural his grandson had drawn for him. That image, for him, was his only remaining pride from the war. The room fell silent, save for the creak of the ceiling fan. Karen's face went pale. Makeup couldn't hide the twitch around her lips. Paul, the treasurer who had always sat quietly beside her, began to stammer. Under the piercing gaze of hundreds of residents, he confessed, "We were pressured to sign. I never wanted this." The words dropped like the final pebble that toppled an already crumbling wall. Amid the tension, an unexpected flicker of humor broke through. Mike, still taut with fury, murmured just loud enough for many to hear, "Should have brought popcorn." Laughter burst out from a few in the back rows, not out of joy, but out of the desperate need for a breath in the suffocating air. But the truth was now undeniable. The photos, the recordings, the first-hand stories of loss, all of it had turned the HOA meeting into a public trial. And Karen, once the ruler, now sat before an invisible jury. John still hadn't spoken another word. He let the community speak for him. Let the burned flag serve as witness. Because he knew. Sometimes silence carries more weight than any shout. And as the room boiled over, everyone understood the next moment would change the entire neighborhood. The only question was, who would shatter the silence, first John, or the residents who had been pushed too far for too long? John stepped up to the podium, the overhead lights casting down across a face hardened by sun, wind, and years. He didn't need to pound the table, nor did he need a microphone. Just his deep voice carried enough weight to drop the packed hall into silence. He said he had buried 2 brothers beneath this flag, that every fold of it was not just fabric but flesh and blood, the names of men who never had the chance to return, that he hung it on his porch not as decoration, but as a reminder to himself, and to anyone who cared to look, that freedom is never free. In that moment, John raised the burned flag high. Smoke still clung to the frayed edges, the acrid scent circling, a living piece of evidence that could not be denied. The 3 veterans standing behind him, Mike and 2 others from town, lifted their hands in salute. No command was given. No marching band played. Only the solemn gesture itself, echoing louder than any gunfire. The entire hall rose to its feet. Chairs scraped, and applause thundered like rolling storms. Many who had stayed silent now stood tall. A widow placed her hand over her chest, her eyes blurring with tears. An elderly man who had once worn an Air Force uniform whispered something softly, like a prayer. Karen, once so used to standing at the center, suddenly seemed so small. She struggled to hold on to her stiff smile, but the hand clutching her file trembled visibly. The papers that once served as her weapon now looked like meaningless scraps. She lowered her head, gathered them together, and quietly walked out of the room. Not a single person followed her. Amid the eruption, Mike leaned toward John, muttering just loud enough. "Told you. It's like some B-grade Hollywood movie just missing the soundtrack." John glanced at him, half stern, half amused. In the heavy tension, even a fleeting note of humor was enough to let the room breathe again. But the truth remained. This battle wasn't over simply because Karen had walked out. Everyone in the hall knew the fine notices, the new bylaws, the hidden schemes, all still lingered. Yet today, for the first time, they had seen one truth. The HOA was not untouchable. John sat down, still gripping the burned flag. The acrid smell lingered, unwilling to fade. He thought of Ramos, of all the faces left behind in the desert, and felt a quiet easing in his chest. For a moment, at least, they had been honored as they deserved. Outside the hall, the Texas sun blazed on. Wind stirred the oak trees, carrying the echo of applause even further. People began to approach John not with wary glances this time, but with respect. A nod, a handshake, a few words of thanks. He wasn't used to the attention, but this time he accepted it. Because it wasn't meant for him alone, it was for all those who had been sheltered one last time beneath that flag. Mike lingered nearby, still chewing on the donut he had carried since morning. He leaned toward Marianne and muttered, "Bet the HOA fines me tomorrow for dropping crumbs on the floor." Marianne laughed, light and relieving, the sound breaking the tension still hanging in the air. John knew the war was only beginning. But that night, as he left the hall, his shoulders felt lighter. He no longer bowed his head, no longer carried silence like a burden. He had shown the entire neighborhood the truth. Some things cannot be extinguished, cannot be bought, cannot be buried under any report. The only question left was, after Karen's departure, how would the HOA strike back? And was this truly a victory or merely the beginning of a new siege? The next day, without any announcement, all of Maplewood seemed to change. Houses that had kept their garage doors shut now opened them, and people lingered in their yards longer, not just to mow the lawn or walk their dogs, but to look toward the porch of John Mercer. A tray of homemade cookies was left at his door, wrapped in a cheap plastic container from Walmart. Inside lay a hurriedly scribbled note, "We owe you a thank you." No name was signed, but John knew where it came from. In America, sometimes the sincerest apologies are not in words, but in quiet, simple acts like this. The children of the neighborhood changed too. Instead of speeding by on their bikes with curious glances, they stopped that day. A few of them placed their hands over their hearts, saluting the flag as they had seen done at school. No one told them to do it, but clearly, they understood. And then Mr. Lee, a Middle East veteran, came to knock on John's door. He wore an old jacket with a VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars logo, a cane in his hand. When John opened the door, Mr. Lee didn't say much. He simply placed his trembling hand on the doorframe, looked John in the eyes and said, "I stand with you." Then he turned and walked away, slowly, like a private ritual shared between two soldiers of different generations. Within less than a week, the HOA collapsed. Karen and her husband withdrew, their financial records under investigation, and a new council was elected. This time, it included voices of those who had once worn uniforms, alongside ordinary families who had been labeled aesthetic violators simply for hanging flower baskets or parking an old pickup in the driveway. Maplewood did not turn into paradise overnight, but at least justice was restored. John refused a seat on the council. He said plainly, "I already have the best seat there is," and he kept his word. Every morning, he sat in his wooden porch chair, hot coffee in hand, watching the flag fly. One autumn morning, the Texas sky was clear, the wind carrying the scent of dry oak leaves. John stood by the flagpole, hand gripping the rope. Marianne stood beside him, her patient presence the quiet strength that had carried him all these years. She placed her hand on his shoulder and softly said, "You didn't come home when you left the battlefield, John. You only truly came home when you dared to raise this flag again." John tightened his grip on the rope, his eyes fixed on the flag unfurling in the wind. As it rose high, the morning light shone through it, coloring red, white, and blue in brilliant hues. No smoke, no ashes, only wind. And in that moment, for the first time, he felt peace within himself. What mattered was not that the HOA had fallen, but that the community had changed. Neighbors no longer saw him as the odd old man. They began to see him as a living part of history, a testament to sacrifices that should never be forgotten. They realized a flag on a porch was not mere decoration, it was memory, blood, and a vow. John sat down in his chair, took a sip of coffee. The laughter of children, the barking of dogs, the soft flap of the flag against the steel pole blended into a symphony of peace. Somewhere out there, perhaps his old comrades were smiling. If Ramos were alive, he would surely say, "The flag is still there, John, and so are you." The lesson here is simple yet powerful. A veteran's war does not end in the deserts of Iraq or the mountains of Afghanistan. It continues on American soil, in the wary glances of neighbors, in the rigid rules of an HOA, in the sleepless nights and memories that never fade. And when a community dares to stand, to show empathy, to leave a tray of cookies instead of suspicion, that is when the war finally ends. The flag rises not only for John Mercer, it rises for all who once stood guard in the dark, who paid the price so it could still fly today. It reminds us, freedom is not free. And sometimes, the greatest victory is not surviving the battlefield, but finding home and peace within your own heart. And you, next time you see a flag flying from a neighbor's porch, what will you see? A piece of cloth or a story yet untold?